Scary Stories. I'm a 27-year-old female and have been suffering for the past 12 or so years. It started just being unable to move, like someone was on top of me, pinning me down. And although I was trying with all of my might to move or to scream, all I could do was barely wiggle my toes and faintly murmur. In the beginning, it was very frightening, and I would try with all my might to wake up. Upon waking, I would be unable to resume sleep for at least a few hours. Now, I have become somewhat used to them. Sometimes, I even lie back and see how long I can take that awful, overpowering feeling. In the end, I always try to wake myself up. Over the years, this thing has kind of metamorphosized into a dark being, something who is doing this deliberately to me for some reason. I suppose this is something that I may have invented in my head to deal with it. I am not really sure. After I got used to it, I never really questioned it. It still occurs about every 2 months or so, sometimes once a night. Other times, it can happen several times in one night. The experience is so frightening because the victims, although paralyzed, seem to have full use of their senses. In fact, it is often accompanied by strange smells, the sound of approaching footsteps, apparitions of weird shadows and glowing eyes, and the oppressive weight on the chest, making breathing difficult, if not impossible. All of the body's senses are telling the victims that something real and unusual is happening to them. The spell is broken, and the victims recover, often on the point of losing consciousness. Fully awake and well, they sit up, completely baffled by what just happened to them, since now the room is entirely normal. Confronted with such a bizarre and irrational experience, it's no wonder that many victims fear that they may have been attacked in their beds by some malevolent spirit, demon, or perhaps an alien visitor. The phenomenon occurs to both men and women of various ages and seems to happen to about 15% of the population at least once in a lifetime. It can occur while the victim is sleeping during the day or night, and it is a worldwide phenomenon that has been documented since ancient times. In the 2nd century, the Greek physician Galen attributed it to indigestion. According to the Encyclopedia of Ghosts and Spirits by Rosemary Ellen Guiley, some individuals suffer repeated attacks over a limited period of time. Others have repeated attacks for years. At the time of his alleged abduction, Antonio Villas Boas was a 23-year-old Brazilian farmer who was working at night to avoid the hot temperatures of the day. On October 16, 1957, he was plowing fields near San Francisco de Sales when he saw what he described as a red star in the night sky. According to his story, the star approached his position, growing in size until it became unrecognizable as a roughly circular or egg-shaped aerial craft with a red light at its front and a rotating cupola on top. The craft began descending to land in the field, extending 3 legs as it did so. At that point, Bayos decided to run from the scene. According to Bayos, he first attempted to leave the scene on his tractor, but when its lights and engine died after traveling only a short distance, he decided to continue on foot. However, he was seized by a 1.5 meter, 5 foot tall humanoid who was wearing gray coveralls and a helmet. Its eyes were small and blue, and instead of speech, it made noises like barks or yelps. 3 similar beings had joined the first in subduing Bayos, and they dragged him inside their craft. Once inside the craft, Bayos said that he was stripped of his clothes and covered from head to toe with a strange gel. He was then led into a large semicircular room through a doorway that had strange red symbols written all over it. Bayos claimed that he was able to memorize these symbols and later reproduce them for investigators. In this room, the beings took samples of Bayos' blood from his chin. After this, he was then taken to a 3rd room and left alone for around half an hour. During this time, some kind of gas was pumped into the room, which made Bayos become violently ill. Shortly after this, Bayos claimed that he was joined in the room by another humanoid. This one, however, was female, very attractive, and naked. She was the same height as the other beings he had encountered, with a small pointed chin and large blue cat-like eyes. Bayos claims that she had long, platinum blonde hair, but her underarm and pubic hair were bright red. Bayos says he was strongly attracted to this woman, and the two had sexual intercourse. During this act, Bayos noted that the female did not kiss him, but instead nipped him on the chin. When it was all over, the female smiled at Bayos, rubbing her belly, and gestured upwards. Bayos took this to mean that she was going to raise their child in space. The female seemed relieved that their task was over, and Bayos himself said that he felt angered by the situation because he felt as though he had been little more than a good stallion for the humanoids. Bayos said that he was then giving back his clothing and taken on a tour of the ship by the humanoids. During this tour, he said that he attempted to take a clock-like device as proof of his encounter, but was caught by the humanoids and prevented from doing so. He was then escorted off the ship and watched as it took off, glowing brightly. When Bayos returned home, he discovered that 4 hours had passed. Antonio Villas Boas later became a lawyer, married, and had 4 children. He stuck to the story of his alleged abduction for his entire life, though some sources say he died in 1992. He died on January 17th, 1991. Arriving at home at about dawn, the Hills assert that they had some odd sensations and impulses they could not readily explain. Betty insisted their luggage be kept near the back door rather than in the main part of the house. Their watches would never work again. Bernie said that the leather strap for the binoculars was torn, though he could not recall it tearing. The toes of his best dress shoes were scraped. Bernie says he was compelled to examine his genitals in the bathroom, though he found nothing unusual. They took long showers to remove possible contamination, and each drew a picture of what they had observed. Perplexed, the Hills say they tried to reconstruct the chronology of events as they witnessed the UFO and drove home, but immediately after they heard the buzzing sounds, their memories became incomplete and fragmented. After sleeping for a few hours, Betty awoke and placed the shoes and clothing she had worn during the drive into her closet, observing that the dress was torn at the hem, zipper, and lining. Later, when she retrieved the items from her closet, she noted a pinkish powder on her dress. She hung the dress on her clothesline, and the pink powder blew away, but the dress was irreparably damaged. She threw it away, but then changed her mind, retrieved the dress, and hung it in her closet. Over the years, 5 laboratories have conducted chemical and forensic analysis on the dress. There were shiny, concentric circles on their car's trunk that had not been there the previous day. Betty and Bernie examined with the compass, noting that when they moved it close to the spots, the needle would whirl rapidly, but when they moved it a few inches away from the shiny spots, it would drop down. Betty telephoned Peace Air Force Base to report their UFO encounter. Though for fear of being labeled eccentric, she withdrew some of the details. On September 22nd, Major Paul W. Henderson telephoned the Hills for a more detailed interview. Henderson's report, dated September 26, determined that the Hills had possibly misidentified the planet Jupiter. This was later changed to optical condition, inversion, and insufficient data. Report 100-161, Air Intelligence Information Record. His report was forwarded to Project Blue Book, the United States Air Force's UFO research project. Within days of the encounter, Betty borrowed a UFO book from a local library. It had been written by Marine Corps Major Donald E. Keogh, who was also the head of National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena, a civilian UFO research group. On September 26th, Betty wrote to Keogh. She related the full story, including the details about the humanoid figures that Bernie had observed through binoculars. Betty wrote that she and Bernie were considering hypnosis to help recall what had happened. Her letter was eventually passed on to Walter N. Webb, a Boston astronomer and an ICAP member. Webb met with the Hills on October 21st, 1961. In a 6-hour interview, the Hills related all they could remember of the UFO encounter. Bernie asserted that he had developed a sort of mental block and that he suspected there were some portions of the event that he did not wish to remember. He described in detail all that he could remember about the craft and the appearance of the somehow not human figures aboard the craft. Webb stated that they were telling the truth and the incident probably occurred exactly as reported, except for some minor uncertainties and technicalities that must be tolerated in any such observations where human judgment is involved. Betty began to have a series of vivid dreams. They continued for 5 successive nights. Never in her memory had she recalled dreams in such detail and intensity, but they stopped abruptly after 5 nights and never returned. They occupied her thoughts during the day. When she finally did mention them to Bernie, he was sympathetic, but not too concerned, and the matter was dropped. Betty did not mention them to Bernie again. In November 1961, Betty began writing down the details of her dreams. In one dream, she and Bernie encountered a roadblock and men who surrounded their car. She lost consciousness, but struggled to regain it. She then realized that she was being forced by two small men to walk in a forest in the nighttime, and of seeing Bernie walking behind her, though when she called to him, he seemed to be in a trance or sleepwalking. The men stood about 5 feet to 5 feet 4 inches tall and were matching blue uniforms with caps similar to those worn by military cadets. They appeared nearly human, with black hair, dark eyes, prominent noses, and bluish lips. Their skin was a grayish color. In the dreams, Betty, Bernie, and the two men walked up a ramp into a disc-shaped craft of metallic appearance. Once inside, Bernie and Betty were separated. She protested and was told by a man she called the leader that if she and Bernie were examined together, it would take much longer to conduct the exams. She and Bernie were then taken to separate rooms. Betty then dreamt that a new man, similar to the others, entered to conduct her exam with the leader. Betty called this new man the examiner and said he had a pleasant, calm manner. Though the leader and the examiner spoke to her in English, the examiner's command of language seemed imperfect, and she had difficulty understanding him. The examiner told Betty that he would conduct a few tests to note the differences between humans and the craft's occupants. He seated her on a chair, and a bright light was shone on her. The man cut off a lock of Betty's hair. He examined her eyes, ears, mouth, teeth, throat, and hands. He saved trimmings from her fingernails. After examining her legs and feet, the man used a dull knife, similar to a letter cutter, to scrape some of her skin onto what resembled cellophane. He then tested her nervous system, and he thrust the needle into her navel, which caused Betty agonizing pain, whereupon the leader waved his hand in front of her eyes, and the pain vanished. The examiner left the room, and Betty engaged in conversation with the leader. She picked up a book with rows of strange symbols that the leader said she could take home with her. She also asked from where he came, and he pulled down an instructional map dotted with stars. In Betty's dream account, the men began escorting the hills from the ship when a disagreement broke out. The leader then informed Betty that she couldn't keep the book, stating that they had decided that the other men did not want her to even remember the encounter. Betty insisted that no matter what they did to her memory, she would one day recall the events. She and Bernie were taken to their car, where the leader suggested that they wait to watch the craft's departure. They did so, then resumed their drive. Although the Hills had noted that they had arrived home later than anticipated, the drive should have taken about 4 hours, 178 miles. They claimed to not have realized that they arrived home 7 hours after their departure from Colebrook. When Holman and Jackson noted this discrepancy to the Hills, the couple had no explanation, a phenomenon UFOologists call missing time. The Hills claimed to recall almost nothing of the 35 miles of U.S. Route 3 between Lincoln, Indian Head, and Ashland. Both claimed to recall an image of a fiery orb sitting on the ground. Betty and Bernie reasoned that it must have been the moon, but Holman and Jackson informed them that the moon had set earlier in the evening. The subject of hypnosis came up, and it was decided that it should be carried out in order to elicit previously irretrievable memories. Bernie was apprehensive about hypnosis, but thought it might help Betty put to rest what Bernie described as the nonsense about her dreams. By February 1962, the Hills were making frequent weekend drives to the White Mountains, hoping that revisiting the site might spark more memories. They were unsuccessful in trying to locate the site where they observed a fiery orb sitting in the road. However, they were able to eliminate several possible routes. They found what they claimed was the capture site on Labor Day weekend in 1965. I sense a malevolent, evil presence in the room that wants to kill me. I can see an impossibly old and terrifying ugly woman crouching in my closet across the bed, staring at me. Remember the demonic witch in Evil Dead? Yeah, that bad. I desperately try to move a finger, a toe, or blink, but nothing. My body is unresponsive. The old hag then stands up and starts to walk toward the bed slowly. The entire time, I try to gain control of my body, but nothing is responding. The old woman then climbs on the bed and sits on my chest. The witch then wraps her hands around my throat and begins to strangle me. The entire time, she is choking me. Her face is just beyond my peripheral vision. But I instinctively know she is beyond hideous. Sometimes I then wake up from this terrifying scenario at the brink of losing consciousness because of the strangulation. But I am still paralyzed. I still sense her evil in the room. She is sitting on the floor beside my bed, and I can hear her breathing and feel her stare upon my face. She then crawls back on the bed, and she begins choking me again. She only did this to terrify me even more. If I'm lucky, I then wake up and check my house for this bitch with a baseball bat. If you're new, go ahead and hit the like button and subscribe to my channel, as it really helps me out. And if you are already subscribed, welcome back and thank you for subscribing.